All right, here we are. I'm Robert Rodriguez, host of the Something About The Beatles podcast, as well as the author of some Beatle books. This is my friend Gary Wenstrup. If you are a listener to the podcast, you will know him as being a guest on it several times. And he was a guy that, he is a lecturer and speaker in his own right on a lot of 60s music acts in the Chicago area. And somehow we never crossed paths that way, but we did meet up at the Fest for Beatle fans, funnily enough. And it was at that juncture that Gary introduced an idea that he had as a listener to the show, thinking that, you know, maybe there are some topics that warrant a follow-up discussion. And I said, lay it on me, get some ideas. And that's how we've proceeded for, last year or something like that?
Yeah.
It's been a while now. So anyway, this is a further extension of our sort of brainstorming ways of getting information out there that don't require the tedium of me spending weeks editing a 90-minute show. So we decided to have fireside chats and just run some questions by, discuss things, and see how it goes with this. So thanks, Gary, for setting this whole thing up.
Sure. Thank you, Robert, for being here. And today we're going to discuss the song Yesterday. It's quite a long and winding road, if you'll forgive that, till we get to the actual recording of Yesterday. And then there's some drama that follows roughly 40 years after the recording as well. So I'll sort of get it started and get Robert, focused on the song Yesterday. So Robert, when and where did Paul come up with the melody for Yesterday?
So that's a story that's one of these things in Beatle lore where it's pretty well known to every fan, the whole Scrambled Eggs, Baby How I Love Your Legs, that he come up with this tune that was floating around for a long time before he came up with the final words or concept for it. It's obviously, as far as the tune goes, it's sort of wistful melody. So that sort of gives you a direction for where you're going to go for the lyrical content at some point. And Scrambled Eggs wasn't going to do it. But according to, when you go back and look at the interviews, because obviously they've been compelled to talk about this since 1965, and I tend to trust Paul's stories closer to the actual time of creation more than I do 40 or 50 years on. And in this instance, what seems to be the common ground consensus is that he was living at Jane Asher's house up in the attic with Peter Asher right across the hall. And we already know that since he moved in, which was 1963 sometime, that they made use of the family's music room, which was in the basement. There was a piano there. Famously, I Want to Hold Your Hand was written on there. Yeah. But there were other tunes along the way during that very productive, hectic period where they just had to crank out the material. So Yesterday was not a tune written to order, like I gotta get the next single done. It was one of these things that Paul literally dreamed and woke up with the melody in his head. And it was convenient that he had access to a piano right nearby and started plunking out the chords to the melody he was hearing in his head. He was knowledgeable enough to have an idea, well, if I'm starting at this point, this is where it should go, as he's intuited basically everything he's ever written. And so he had this melody. Best we can tell, people have tried to figure this out. There's a little bit of controversy because George Martin was of the opinion that it was January of 1964, right before they came to the States for the Sullivan Show. They were in Paris, and that was when I Want to Hold Your Hand went to #1. They got the word of it there. Yeah. That was the juncture that Paul first played in the melody. That sounds awfully early. It could be, though, because they wouldn't record it. If that is actually accurate, they didn't record it for another year and a half.
Right.
But there were other people that say, I think it was Chris Drea from the Yardbirds, that said they were sharing a bill with the Beatles at the end of 1964, that sort of Christmas package tour they were doing, and that Paul was backstage with an acoustic guitar and played it for them, saying, hey guys, what do you think of this? As if it was newly written. So it puts it at the opposite end of 1964. So who among us, their memories are infallible instruments of recall.
Right.
So, these guys are busy living their lives, hectic schedules, all that stuff. So we don't know, but very likely at some point it appeared in 1964.
Great.
So then going into 1965, they start out the year, February, they're shooting Help and also working on the soundtrack. They started to lay down those songs. Yesterday doesn't get recorded properly until June 14th, by which time they're long done shooting Help. But in between, they've done some live performances, and I believe it was, I'm not 100% sure the timetable, but Because George Martin got shoved out of doing the soundtrack work for the second Dick Lester movie for Help in favor of Ken Thorne. For whatever reason, George Martin and Dick Lester did not get along. And although George Martin was responsible for the incidental music on A Hard Day's Night, he was not given that role a second time. George Martin, being successful and full of himself by 1965, said, screw you, I'm going to do my own soundtrack anyway. And so he put out a George Martin orchestra album, Help and other tunes, Beatles stuff. And so he did his instrumental versions of some of the Help soundtrack tunes, as well as some other songs that were floating around, one of them being Auntie Gin's theme, because it's instrumental. There's no words to I've Just Seen a Face just yet. So that's how we recorded it. But also Scrambled Eggs, I think, is on that release too. It's not Yesterday yet. So that if I'm getting this history right, I think that he did his own stab at it before the Beatles did, or maybe around the same time that it came out first. Okay. In any event, so the Beatles recorded on June 14th. Very productive day. That's the day they record I've Just Seen a Face, I'm Down, take a break, come back to the studio, and nail the backing to Yesterday. At this juncture, they still haven't quite figured out what the arrangement's going to be, if it's going to be a band performance, if it's going to be a partial band performance. There was talk of Lennon accompanying Paul on organ for that. That didn't really pan out. I don't think there's any extant recordings of that. And you hear on the take one that came out on Anthology, George Harrison in the background going, what key? And Paul telling what the chords are. So they set out, not quite having an arrangement figured out yet, but believing it was going to end up being a group recording in some fashion. And by the time that session ended, and I think they captured the keeper take of Yesterday backing track at least. Paul did do a run at the vocal that day, but it was sort of evolved into, well, Paul, from George Martin, I hear this as having strings on it, specifically a string quartet, to Paul's reflexive answer, oh no, I don't want no Mantovani on my Beatle record. And he had to no, this is what I had in mind, sit him down. And I think it was the next day they worked out a string arrangement for it. So that day, that first day, it was just him on his Texan acoustic guitar, laying down the backing as we know it. And then the following day, I think, was when George Martin scored it alongside Paul, who had some input to suggest. And then they recorded the strings and overdubbed them onto it. And Paul instructed the string players no vibrato, because he thought that was too sentimental sounding. But he, to his credit, went along with George Martin's vision of the song, which ended up being, I think they double-tracked the strings, and no vibrato, but Paul had some actual input into some stray, bluesy seventh notes that ended up in the arrangement.
Right.
Yeah, right. So that's his rock and roll aspect to it. And so they're done with it, and it becomes an album track on the Help album in England. It's not out in America yet. So this is the summer of '65. They go off, play Shea Stadium, start their North America tour. I think it's right before that, mid-August of '65, that they are taping some TV appearances for both sides of the Atlantic. Thank Your Lucky Stars, I think, was the one in Britain that did, where they premiere Help, and they did Yesterday, maybe Tick the Ride, I forget what else. But then, I know very specifically, the day before Shea in New York City, they went to the Ed Sullivan Theater and did I Feel Fine, Act Naturally, I'm Down, Yesterday, Help, Ticket to Ride maybe. But so when they did that before the public, there's an anecdote Paul tells about that. I don't know what the audience was for this 1965 Beatles show, because it aired a month later. They were pre-taping it. But he's got his acoustic on his back. He's getting ready as they're doing the introduction. And one of the stagehands says to him, nervous? No, I'm fine. Why? Well, I'd be nervous if I was out there by myself playing before 65 million people. Have fun.
Go get them.
Go get them.
Yeah.
So there are pictures taken. It's not evident when you watch the video of that, but there's pictures taken on the set that show an actual string quartet by the stage. So people have always wondered, was that canned? I mean, it's definitely a live vocal. Might they have pre-taped the string section? I don't know. I mean, it's possible that they did and had these guys mime, or it's possible they were live to it. But in any event, the Beatles themselves were totally live on this occasion, and it's as evidenced by John's flubbing the lyrics and Paul switching verses on I'm Down, things like that. Ringo all nervous and out of tune. So that was the public debut when that aired, which was the first week of September 1965. The very next day, that Sunday night Sullivan Show, it is released by Capitol Records as a single in America, back with Act Naturally. So here you have a lead vocal from the two most popular Beatles in America, Paul and Ringo.
Believe it or not.
Yeah, believe it or not. And Capitol gets to do this because the Beatles had a lot less control of their product there. I mean, as evidenced by the sequence of Capitol albums that were coming out, this sort of hodgepodge compilations, which maybe we'll talk about in a future show. But anyway, that's what ends up happening. And lo and behold, it goes to number one.
And what about in England? Was it released as a single in England?
It wasn't released as a single in 1965 in England. Strictly a help album track. But George Martin had the conversation with Brian Epstein. It's just a Paul record. It's just Paul. Should we put it out as just a Paul single?
Yeah.
And Brian's like, no, absolutely not. We can't do that. It's Beatles. They're the whole package. We're not breaking up the group over this. And, George Martin went along with that. That's fine. And it didn't matter. It was a moot point in 1965 anyway. Everything was coming out as a Beatles album, Beatles package. But it came out as Beatles in America. Funnily enough, it was less than a year later when Brian Wilson recorded for Capitol. The Pet Sounds album comes out, and they issued Caroline No as a single. And that one is not as obviously a solo performance. It's not just him and a guitar and strings.
Right.
It's got the full backing of the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah.
But it is credited to Brian Wilson.
Brian Wilson alone.
Brian Wilson.
And actually, one of the reasons they said they did that, the Capitol released that, was they were trying to inspire Brian to finish the rest of Pet Sounds. And so they thought if he had a single out, that might be the impetus to get him to finish the rest of the record.
Right, yeah.
So it's not released as a single. Do you think Paul resented that, or that it's not released as a single in England? Do you think Paul resented that at all? Such an incredible piece of work,
right,
not released as a single.
I don't think he resented it. I think that at the time, if you read their quotes and hear what they had to say, it seems they were very self-conscious about it. That they recognized it was a good piece of work, but they were very self-conscious, like, this is us with our trousers off, like, this is not, we're a rock band. Yeah. We don't do stuff, we don't do strings.
Right.
We don't do this sort of plaintive acoustic ballad, although of course they had by that point.
Sure.
Called Till It Was You.
Yeah.
And it's just not the full backing of the band. And so I think once they got accepted and went to number one, and they recognized that the public was not going to, oh, that's not a Beatles record, Beatles are rock and roll. They accepted it and embraced it. And you had, by year's end in Britain, Matt Monro did a cover of it, which may have been produced by George Martin, because I know he was producing him, and also Marianne Faithfull, who performs it at the end of the year on the Music of Lennon and McCartney TV special, which was really something to boost those two as songwriters by bringing in Henry Mancini and all these other prestige acts to show that these guys are serious composers.
Yeah.
So, and yesterday you couldn't ignore that, being 65.
Yeah.
In fact, you've got them making fun of it in the Christmas message that year.
Right. So there are those who say that Yesterday sort of takes the Beatles to the next level, in that it's a teenage phenomenon, the Beatles, but once the parents hear Yesterday, it really widens the Beatles' audience and legitimizes them.
Sure.
Do you believe that?
Absolutely, yeah. And when you've got the stamp of approval, I mean, if it hadn't been enough in 64 that Ella Fitzgerald covers Can't Buy Me Love, I think she was the first big name previous generation artist to take them seriously enough to lay down a Beatles song and have a hit with it. And you had other people by the time, slowly, jazz people were starting to pay attention, pop people certainly, that are basically covering the hits of the day.
Yeah.
They're gravitating toward, these Beatles, they're unstoppable as songwriters.
Yeah.
They're selling millions of records. Why wouldn't I want a piece of that?
Yeah.
If I can make my own.
Sure.
Alma Cogan, not known in the States at all, but she was a pop singer, more or less a peer of Petula Clark, who Petula Clark and Alma Cogan both started out when they were kids, basically, as singers, World War II vintage. And then it was Alma's career that really took off during the 50s, where she was sort of in the mold of a Patti Page type of girl singer, doing that sort of silly pop stuff. Whereas Petula Clark, it took her till the 60s to really get her footing as a pop act when she connected with not Mickey Mouse,
Tony Hatch.
Yeah. And he co-wrote a lot of her material. So that was when she kind of fell in with the British invasion in terms of American audiences, having number ones with Downtown and stuff like that. Even though she was, that much older than the Beatles, she wasn't really of their generation or that scene. Nonetheless, Al McCogan, who by that time had been connected with the Beatles, there's been a lot of suggestion, including from Cynthia Lennon, that John was having an affair with her, and that she died of cancer like within a fortnight of him being introduced to Yoko Ono in October of '66. They think that, that would have been the love of his life had she lived. Anyway, she was a bit of a musicologist, and Paul actually played her the melody pretty early on, saying, "What song is this?" thinking he hadn't written it. And she's like, "It's beautiful, whatever it is, but I've never heard it before."
Which solidified to Paul that he had written an original tune, but he wasn't just remembering something from another era.
There's people that studied and said, well, this has similarities to a Nat King Cole song from the 1940s. You know what? Sometimes things are random. People have also pointed out Dave Brubeck, the Take Five album, or Time Out, the album Take Five on it. There's a song in there called Kathy's Waltz. Are you familiar with that?
No.
It's jazz, so a lot of it's improvisational, whatever the horn players are doing at a given moment. Paul Desmond playing sax. But he plays a melody line, that verbatim ended up in And I Love Her. And it's just a series of notes, he doesn't repeat it. So one would have to conclude that somehow Paul found that album, heard it before 1964, it seeped into his consciousness, and maybe he repurposed that melody for And I Love Her without even knowing it. Nobody called copyright infringement on him in real time. But I think in a world composed of music with a finite number of notes, sometimes things will align. And I don't think that anybody's really made a solid case for Yesterday in any way being off.